I've been a semi-truck driver for 9 years, and during that time I've seen some crazy things that most people wouldn't believe. But you know what they say, nothing can prepare you for the future. I found that out the hard way. On a cold December evening, I had been driving all day from Seattle, Washington to Boise, Idaho. This was one of my regular routes, and it felt like the miles just flew by. But near the end of my shift, I felt the exhaustion creeping in, and I decided to pull into a rest stop near the Snake River Canyon, just off the I-84 freeway. I never took any chances with rest stops, so I parked my rig at the far end of the parking lot, making sure there were plenty of other vehicles between mine and any potential hazards. I put the parking brakes on, grabbed my flashlight, and hopped out of the cab to make my way toward the rest stop bathrooms. As I was walking, I noticed a woman standing in the shadows. On the edge of the parking lot, she looked disheveled and frantic, and it was clear that something was wrong. I assumed that she was just a homeless person that had taken shelter for the night, but as I got closer, she rushed forward towards me. "Please," she pleaded, "I need your help. My husband just called in and he's been having chest pains. I need to get to the hospital." The look of fear in her eyes was enough to make my blood run cold. I hesitated, but I could tell the woman was desperate and I couldn't just abandon her and leave her stranded. I reluctantly agreed and we climbed into the cab of my truck. I asked her a few questions to get some information about her husband and his condition. She said her name was Claire, and her husband's name was Eric. She added that he was also having trouble breathing and was complaining of dizziness. He told her it was getting worse by the minute, so we had to get there quickly. We drove in silence as my mind was spinning. I navigated the winding roads and made my way toward the hospital. I had a million questions running through my head, but now wasn't the time to ask them. Finally, when we reached the hospital, I pulled up to the emergency room drop-off zone. Before I could say anything, she was already out of the door and sprinting towards the entrance. I put the truck in park and got out to follow her. My heart was pounding so hard. When I reached the entrance, she was nowhere to be seen. I frantically searched the lobby and the hallway, but there was no sign of her. I asked the lady at the reception desk if she saw where she went, and she led me to the room. When we got to the hallway, I spotted Claire slouched on the ground against the wall. Eric was dead after a few moments of silence. I finally mustered the courage to ask Claire what had happened, but she was too grief-stricken to answer. I offered to drive her back to the rest stop, but all she mumbled was no. I want to go home with Eric. I was heartbroken to hear that, and ended up convincing Claire to let me drive her back to the rest stop. Despite her utter shock, when we were almost there, I finally worked up the courage to ask her more about what happened. Before I showed up, everything she was saying sounded absolutely devastating until she broke down and confessed something horrible to me in tears. She said we had a terrible argument earlier and I slipped something into his drink. My mouth dropped open in shock and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine when we finally arrived at the rest stop. Claire got out and slowly walked away. I watched her. She disappeared back into the rest stop after collecting myself and taking a few deep breaths. I called the police. I guess I learned a pretty tough lesson that night. No matter how much experience you have in life, you never know what the future can hold.
Don't miss out on the bone-chilling thrills. Subscribe now and prepare to be haunted by the horrors that await.
Sheltered life, usually only leaving the house for grocery runs and doctor appointments. I didn't even go to school. My mother decided it was best to homeschool me. I was, and still am, very socially awkward as a result of my upbringing. Though I'm getting better, one thing I did leave the house for as the child was to compete in talent competitions. I was a pianist. I still am, though a little rusty. I had a newspaper article published for me once to advertise a fundraising concert I was holding at my local church. I needed funds to go to a competition 500 miles away. In the article, the journalist recorded a quote from me. She had asked what I thought of my talent, and being a child in a Christian house, I replied, "It's not my talent. God let me borrow it fast forward till I became an adult." I was eager to leave the house and to get out on my own. I decided to get my commercial driver's license so I could get out and see as much of the world as I could. Besides driving long hours and the occasional night of having trouble finding a halfway decent place to park at the end of the day, I enjoyed it one night. I was pulling into a truck stop to park for the night as I was taking my dog out to do his business. I passed by the truck next to mine. It had its driver's side window down, and the driver was sitting in the driver's seat. He called out to me as I passed him, complimenting that he liked my dog and asked if he was friendly. I thanked him and informed him that my dog was shy of strangers, being that I sat in a truck all day with no human interaction.
Besides the occasional honk and guy flipping me off for being slow, I longed for conversation and I told him I would be right back.
A few minutes later, after putting my dog in my truck, I walked over to talk to my parking spot neighbor. We chatted for a while, him in his chair and I standing on the top step on the side of his truck. After about 20 minutes, he asked me if I noticed that his arm had bumped mine 7 times. My arm was on top of his armrest as I clunked to the side of his truck. This surprised me. I had not noticed it at all, thinking back on it. I believe he was testing to see how situationally aware I was. I told him I had not noticed it was cold outside, considering it was the middle of winter. So he invited me to sit in his truck to continue our conversation. This is where I should have had alarm bells ringing in my head, but growing up so sheltered, I was too trusting of people I entered. We continued to talk, though the conversation started crossing lines, asking questions that were too personal. He was asking me stuff like, what's your phone number? Who are your parents? What was your grandparents' full names? Where do you live, regretfully? I answered him, thankfully. I had the sense to at least not give him my address. We had also swapped seats during the conversation. First, he had moved to the passenger seat so I could sit in the driver's seat, but then we swapped to where I was in the passenger seat and he in the driver's seat. The conversation started to take a weird and creepy turn after all those questions he asked. Did you notice that my eyes don't have any color? His irises were black, just 2 black orbs surrounded by the white of his eyes. This is where I started to feel very uneasy. He started talking about my childhood, and this is where he said something that disturbed me. The most he asked, "Didn't you have a talent as a kid?" I said yes, and that I played the piano. He replied, "Wouldn't it be a life, since you only borrowed it?" I had not mentioned to him anything about that article, and the city it was from was too small to be noticed by someone that lived so far away. He lived like 2,000 miles away from my hometown. I was ready to get out of there. I was trying to think of how to excuse myself without browsing suspicious. He started trying to convince me to ride with him to his next delivery, and to just leave my truck where it was that he would bring me back the next day. I declined. He then asked if I would come visit him at his home again. I declined. It had been several hours, so I decided to tell him I needed to take my dog out to do his business again, so he didn't go in my truck. I exited his truck and took my dog out again. But this time when my dog was done, I went back in my truck and locked the doors. I also tilted both seats of forward, so it would be difficult for him if he entered my truck, buying me time if needed. The next morning he was gone. I continued on my day, relief that I was away from him. A few hours later, he called me. "So why did you tilt your seats forward last night?" I told him it was to keep my dog from jumping on them. He continued to talk to me, though I kept my answers short this time. I blocked his number after he hung up and later decided to change my phone number. I know I was lucky that it didn't go farther than a creepy conversation. I'm more careful now about who I talk to and where I am. Be careful, everyone. Never get into a stranger's vehicle, no matter how friendly and innocent they seem. I've learned my lesson. We have a family like all over the country. In the desolate regions of the American Midwest, where miles of open road seem to stretch forever, a truck driver named Jack embarks on his solitary journey. With the hum of his engine and the flickering of streetlights passing by, a world of solitude engulfed him. Jack has always enjoyed the freedom of the open road and the thrill of navigating his monster truck across vast landscapes. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the allure of the job began to fade. The long hours spent alone behind the wheel took its toll on his soul, and an alarming feeling of loneliness settled in his depths. Each day, Jack's only human interaction came through the crackling sound of his CB radio, as he exchanged short greetings with other passing truck drivers. They were fleeting communications, nothing more than distant voices in the dark, echoing their tales of woe and longing. Their conversations were fleeting lifelines, temporary distractions from the overwhelming silence that permeated Jack's existence. The isolation became more apparent as the night went on. Jack's mind played tricks on him as he stared into the darkness, shadows dancing on the periphery of his vision. Every creak and whine of the truck became an eerie whisper, and the empty stretches of road seemed to stretch into a void, swallowing it whole. Solitude gnawed at his soul, leaving him longing for the warmth of human companionship. Sometimes, deep in the night, Jack would stop by abandoned truck stops. There, he would glimpse the flickering fluorescent lights and the silent conversations of his fellow travelers, but their presence added to his loneliness. The laughter and camaraderie shared by others were a sobering reminder of what he had lost. He felt like an outsider, forever confined to the fringes of society, doomed to loneliness in his chosen profession. Weeks turned into months, until Jack's perception of time blurred. The monotonous routine of driving, sleeping, and eating all mixed together, exacerbating his isolation. The road became his only companion, and he viewed the changing landscape with a sense of detachment, as if he were an observer rather than an active participant in the world. Jack's spirit waned, exhausted by the weight of his loneliness. The once vibrant man had now become a shell of his former self, his eyes hollow and his voice a mere whisper. Solitude consumed him, leaving him a victim of his self-imposed exile. Jack's truck became his prison, and the vast expanse of open road served as a reminder of his eternal loneliness. The truck drivers who passed him continued their journey, unaware of the haunted spirit hiding behind the wheel. As Jack drives off into the sunset, forever lost in the desolation of his existence, his story becomes another tragic tale of a truck driver swallowed up by the abyss of solitude. Deep in his loneliness, he begins to question his choices. What led him to this life of perpetual loneliness? Was it worth sacrificing his connections and his sanity for the sake of illusory freedom? Answers eluded him, lost in the echoes of the road, as he continued his solitary journey into the unknown. The days are hazy in the nights, and the nights are hazy in the day. Time has become an abstract concept, unrelated to Jake's existence. The truck, now an extension of his soul, carried him into the heart of solitude. He was trapped in a paradox, surrounded by vast landscapes and empty highways, yet completely cut off from the world.
Jack's spirit waned, exhausted by the weight of his loneliness. The once vibrant man had now become a shell of his former self, his eyes hollow and his voice a mere whisper. Solitude consumed him, leaving him a victim of his self-imposed exile. Jack's truck became his prison, and the vast expanse of open road served as a reminder of his eternal loneliness. The truck drivers who passed him continued their journey, unaware of the haunted spirit hiding behind the wheel. As Jack drives off into the sunset, forever lost in the desolation of his existence, his story becomes another tragic tale of a truck driver swallowed up by the abyss of solitude. Deep in his loneliness, he begins to question his choices. What led him to this life of perpetual loneliness? Was it worth sacrificing his connections and his sanity for the sake of illusory freedom? Answers eluded him, lost in the echoes of the road, as he continued his solitary journey into the unknown. The days are hazy in the nights, and the nights are hazy in the day. Time has become an abstract concept, unrelated to Jake's existence. The truck, now an extension of his soul, carried him into the heart of solitude. He was trapped in a paradox, surrounded by vast landscapes and empty highways, yet completely cut off from the world. One fateful night, as the truck was rolling along a desolate stretch of road, a sudden realization struck like a bolt of lightning. The real horror lies not in the loneliness that consumes him, but in the knowledge that he has become a prisoner of his own choices. The road had taken hold of his soul, and he had willingly surrendered himself to its merciless grasp. With new persistence, he made a decision. He sought solace in the company of others, even if it meant giving up the truck that had become his only companion. He longed to be freed from the shackles of solitude and to regain his humanity. As dawn paints the horizon with orange and gold stripes, Jake spots a small town in the distance. The sight filled him with a glimmer of hope. He swerved off the highway, leaving behind the relentless road that had been chasing him for so long. With every step towards the city, he felt the weight of loneliness rise from his shoulders. The journey had scarred him, leaving behind a tale of horror and isolation. But in the face of adversity, he found the strength to seek a different path. One that would lead him back to embracing humanity and connection.